Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome one and all to a briefing. This is a briefing in Lismore about codex and about health freedom and about the legislation that is at foot to probably suppress health freedom. This started on the 1st of April when we kicked off these seminars in Sydney. It was after an intensive couple of weeks of research where I discovered a situation that nobody had yet made public. Nobody had discussed, and yet various things had happened, treaties had been signed without public knowledge or consent. We've been all over the eastern states, and we've had an extraordinary result in that we've brought groups of people together, organisations together, individuals together. Stories have emerged of governmental interference with manufacturers, outrageous compliance costs, and so on, stories of which have been previously not heard in the press or in the radio. The sense of it was that we blew the lid off something, a dirty, dark secret that nobody was talking about. And I'll tell you a little bit about that later, but I am very pleased to be able to bring about opening this wound so that we as Australians in this region can actually start healing our country. So the history of this campaign has not been long, since April, but already we've heard from people who've stood up to authorities and been successful. We've heard of people who have got together in their communities and created and formed groups and new groups, the likes of which Australia has never really seen. And I believe this is an emergence of new activism, very much like the kind that I saw in the 1960s. Now, some of you will have noticed, since this information has gone into the public domain, that there has been a misinformation campaign. There has been a campaign out there whereby various government authorities and various peak bodies that even represent manufacturers and other healthcare interest groups have disseminated various bulletins and various fact sheets that purport to dissent from the information that I'm giving. And in fact, it doesn't. None of those fact sheets that I have yet seen even deals with the information that you are about to receive this afternoon. When I'm finished briefing you, I don't mind what opinion you have about it. That is entirely up to you. What the important thing about this is that you have had an opportunity to see this information, which most all Australians, with the exception of the 1,000 people that we have so far briefed since April, have seen. So thank you very much all for coming. I want to just clarify some things that confuse people. There's a lot of confusion out there, and it has to do with the difference between natural medicine and supplements and pharmaceuticals. Natural medicine and supplements has been around for thousands of years. And the creators and manufacturers and the dispensers of those natural medicines have also been around for thousands of years. So this has created health specialties. It's created doctors specializing in nutritional medicine and herbalists and naturopaths and homeopaths. And so it has a very long history of safety. In fact, herbs and minerals and vitamins and antioxidants have a huge safety margin. And the vitamins and minerals and antioxidants are actually essentials. They're daily essentials in people's diet, without which human beings cannot live. So they must have these things daily. And what humans don't consume, they actually will discard. And that's how the human body works. We don't have to worry about how many oranges we eat and whether we're going to get an overdose of vitamin C. The body simply uses it and discards whatever excess it has. Even Nostradamus, who was around in the Middle Ages, realised that rose petals, which were high in vitamin C, could actually save people from dying during the days of the Black Plague. And he saved a lot of people that way. But he had the same problem that we do today, because he was actually, in saving people, he was actually ostracised and regularly driven out of various communities and had to be a travelling doctor to heal people of the Black Plague. So we might say, what's changed? Nothing much. Something has changed, however. In the 1940s and 50s, the pharmaceutical industry sprang up from the chemical industry, which in its early days was in Germany in the form of IG Farben, and from the Farben industry came Merck and other chemical companies, and other pharmaceutical companies, I should say. And they manufactured drugs. And drugs are not essentials. There is a vitamin deficiency condition and many other essential nutrient deficiency conditions, but there is not a Prozac deficiency condition or a tranquilizer deficiency condition, much as the pharmaceutical companies would like us to believe. However, they were very busy manufacturing and synthesizing and creating and for us and patenting their product, so that they and they alone can be the originators and the sellers of these particular drugs. And so it has now become a billion-dollar industry. And the industry is multinational, which means it doesn't reside in any particular country, so it has no conscience particularly about people. So when we talk about nutrients, we talk about vastly different issue than when we talk about pharmaceuticals, and the two should not and cannot possibly be put into the same category. And if we can remember this, a lot of confusion will go when we talk a little bit later about pharmaceutical company infiltration into the natural supplement industry. You will immediately recognize that that is an infiltration. That is an attempt for one industry to take over yet another completely different industry. The supplement industry is primarily based as a local Australian industry because it uses natural ingredients, cheap and natural ingredients that are not patented, and it creates minerals, vitamins, antioxidants, and a whole host of others, amino acids, and a whole host of other products from natural ingredients, and from usually local or Australian manufacturers. All right, well, now that we've got that a little bit set, I have created a little snapshot that hopefully makes things very simple about who's who, who's doing what, and who's paying the rent. So this is my pyramid, and at the base of the pyramid there is the community, and that's most of us. 99.99% of us are the community. And we sit here, we are literally the supporters of everything and of everyone. And in our community, we have values and ethics that most of us recognize to be true and right and correct. And from that community, there springs laws coming from agreements that we all make in the community. Now, I know everybody's different and everybody's got different agreements, but one agreement that we all have is that Australia is, at least theoretically, a democracy. Is that correct? Theoretically? So that this is an agreement that we have all made, and we live under this agreement. All right. So, once upon a time, when the community was a little more simple, shall we say, because we needed representatives, because the community expanded and more people. So, we designated a parliament, or we acquired a parliament. And so, our community values and ethics were communicated to our MPs. And the MPs then were supposed to be doing our will and reflecting our standards and our morals and our ethics. And so laws were created. Laws that presumably reflected the community standards. And most people didn't have any problem in obeying proper moral laws that did reflect those community standards. All right, so then we got a little bit bigger and a bit more populous, and the Parliament then had to create various departments to administer the community. And so in terms of our health care, the Parliament created statutory bodies. And basically, and I know we've got a lawyer here, so I'm going to make it very, very basic, but a statute is just a rule book. Statutory body has a rule book made by Parliament that it functions within. Would you say that would be a fair thing? Okay, so a statutory body, we have the state medical boards being the statutory body of the respective state parliaments. Okay, now we're looking at federal parliament here, but the same goes with state parliaments, of course. They've created statutory bodies to look after various things. We have here the health department, so we've got the state health departments and the federal health department as well, and that also is a statutory body. And over here we have the TGA, which we all know and love, which stands for the Therapeutic Goods Administration, and they were responsible for drugs, and that's for registering and licensing drugs, and chemicals now, same thing, licensing chemicals, and they have a little bit to do with genetically engineered products. They have another committee to do that, and as of 1999, they started to register nutrients, okay, which they call therapeutic goods. Okay, and therapeutic goods is a word that now encompasses both drugs and supplements. They are both classed as therapeutic goods. All right, very good. So the TGA is approximately 1980-ish. It was created, and in 1999 it started to take over control and licensing of supplements. All right, now that's all very well. We've got the people, the Parliament, the statutory bodies, the various administering bodies reflecting the community values and ethics. Well, that's fine, isn't it? I mean, that's the way things should be. Now, most of you will realise that most recently, in the last 20 years or so, there's been another community, and that community is outside this community. And I've put them outside the pyramid because this community consists of entities. This community consists of corporations, which are transnational corporations, and it consists of a raft of other entities, which I call the global elite. You can call it the World Bank or whatever you wish, and you can fill in the blanks. I'm sure some of you have got some ideas of who you'd like to put there. These entities also have instrumentalities through which they have tremendous influence, usually arising from the United Nations, and from the UN arises also various instrumentalities, one of which is the World Health Organization, and from there arises various codex committees. Now, we're all here because codex, okay, but there are many codex committees. There are committees about food and fish and agriculture and grain and all those kinds of things, but there is also a codex committee which sits at the moment deciding about vitamins and minerals. The Codex Committee is also tied into the World Trade Organization and a whole raft of treaties which exist out here in this jurisdiction. Okay? So I've labelled this as being an international jurisdiction because it's very difficult for somebody here in the community to actually communicate with any of these people. Would you agree with that, perhaps? It's extremely difficult. I'd love to have their number. I'd love to ring them up. Okay, so now what has happened is that there has been a subtle shift, and herein is the problem. These entities have brought pressure to bear onto Parliament. And people say, well, how has that happened? Well, there's campaign funds, there's lobbying, powerful lobbying by powerful groups of individuals with a lot of money and a lot of power and a lot of influence behind them. And it's no secret, it's certainly no conspiracy that corporations give politicians money for their campaign funds. I mean, that's just the reality of it, isn't it? And I'm sure that we couldn't muster any similar types of monetary influence, shall we say. But we do have a vote, and we are 99.9% of it. Be that as it may, we now have these entities directly in contact with our government instrumentalities, and we are beginning to see laws emerging from Parliament that do not reflect the interests of the community. In fact, they reflect the interests of other entities, which are not human beings. They're corporate entities. Now, very interestingly, on a number of fronts, we have the health department, for example, and you'll be aware that the health department and the Department of Community Services often interact in some very subtle ways. For example, if a family doesn't wish to have a particular medical treatment done, the health department, for example, will recommend a vaccination schedule of 22 vaccinations. And if a parent doesn't want their child to have 22 vaccinations, then there might be a little bit of difficulty. So we are starting to see the effects of pharmaceutical corporations that develop new vaccines all the time, and then the influence by the manufacturer onto the various health departments, which then either mandate the vaccines or they recommend the vaccines, and they shoot out information to all the doctors who are then told that they must vaccinate the children. And that is a direct line, it's a direct commercial line, usually into the community, that results in an instant $1 billion for the company who's made the new vaccine. So we're going from here to there, and bingo, there's the money. It's not hard to follow the money trail. And so now we're seeing compulsory treatments happening, compulsory medicine, people being forced to have their children vaccinated, people being forced to have their children medicated, either with psychiatric drugs or other kinds of drugs, and people having forced to have their children have chemotherapy forcibly administered. So we have a situation that I have called the emergence of corporate medicine or compulsory medical treatment. And you will find that many drugs now are subsidised by the Australian taxpayer. And so it is now a way of making drugs compulsory almost and having the taxpayer subsidise them. So it's a fairly good little money spinner. So that's with the health department. We've got, for example, the State Medical Board, which licenses and polices doctors. And we have had a huge increase in doctors being harassed, doctors who happen to be using natural therapies. So again, we are looking at this kind of influence being brought to bear, which is then creating a gatekeeper and sorting out the wheat from the chaff in accordance with what kind of medicine groups wish to have practiced. And we're now seeing almost all orthodox medicine being pharmaceutically based. So it's a neat little, when you can see things a little more clearly, I think it's very helpful, and I hope that has helped. Now, with respect to the TGA, let's get back to the TGA, which is why we're here. With respect to the TGA, we now have a situation whereby we are coming under very heavy pressure, and I'll explain a little bit later exactly how that's happening, because it seems lately that most people are telling us, no, that's simply not true. Codex has nothing to do with it. In Australia, supplements are regulated as drugs, and we have nothing to do with it. As I mentioned earlier, in 1999, and I'll just quote you from this article by Val Johansson, published in the ACNEM Journal, changes to the Therapeutic Goods Act will create a separate part in the Act for Complementary Medicines and establish the Complementary Medicines Evaluation Committee as a statutory committee. Okay, good. And so that was in 1999, and that was in response to the situation having to sort out the supplement situation. Okay, well, since then, the TGA began to regulate each and every manufacturer and inspect the premises each year from 1999 to 2003. And there were no prosecutions in those years. There were no prosecutions in the 2 years prior to the Pan Pharmaceutical debacle by the TGA, which means that the regulator found the Australian supplement industry was working quite well and safely, and found no breaches of safety or any quality control regulations whatsoever in those years. Now, that all changed in 2003. In April of 2003, Pan Pharmaceuticals had a problem with one of their products, and that product was voluntarily recalled, and that was the Travacam product. Now, that was a product that was called a microdose product, which contained a small dose of pharmaceutical. And the Pan Pharmaceutical company has actually got a very interesting history. It was owned by Jim Salem and created from scratch by him over about 20 years, and it became the fourth largest supplier and manufacturer of natural products in the world. And it was a phenomenal thing for an Australian-owned company to actually hold that place in the world as a supplier and manufacturer. It was quite extraordinary that he had been able to achieve this. He also supplied and manufactured 1,700 other natural types of products and a small range of pharmaceuticals. Now, in April 2003, there was a problem with one of his products. He did recall it voluntarily, and as was customary in the manufacturing industry, manufacturers recalled it and fixed the problem, notified everyone, and maintained safe production. And every manufacturer in the world is required to do that, exactly that. And that is what the company began to do until they were raided by the TGA. They were raided, they had their doors closed, they were not allowed to fix the problem, they were shut down. The liquidator was called in very, very quickly. And within 6 months, the liquidator had sold the company in a fire sale, a $500 million company, for $20 million, had dismantled it totally. Now, as it happened, it began a spate of a regulatory frenzy by the TGA. And they went through the Australian manufacturers like a dose of salts. And after Pan Pharmaceuticals, in our clinic at least, we had a lot of problems accessing supplements. And a lot of it was pulled off the shelf, some of them permanently, some of them for 6 and 7 months. Health food stores went to the wall. Manufacturers went to the wall. Compliance costs of manufacturers by the TGA were imposed. Some of those costs ranged between $1.6 million to $3 million. One of the manufacturers who had a $1.5 million bill had it because they were required by the TGA to put in a new telephone system throughout their factory. So this didn't even pertain to any quality control issues. The thing that was most disturbing during that time was the fact that reports indicate that the TGA came into various companies, jackbooted often, and closed them down and required the owners to undertake agreements, non-disclosure agreements. Some went out voluntarily, relinquished their license voluntarily because they were intimidated, and they felt, for good reason, intimidated, I would say. And some are very quiet because they have signed agreements not to speak. And the bigger ones are struggling currently with their compliance costs. I know at least of one manufacturer big enough to tell the TGA to go jump in the lake with their agreements and didn't. Another type of agreement that was proposed to the manufacturers was one that promised that the manufacturer would not take legal action against the TGA if in fact they'd suffered financial damages or went out of business. Now, extraordinarily, 2 weeks after Pan Pharmaceuticals, the TGA claimed that there was a community outcry for the government to fix this terrible problem with supplements, none of the 1,600 supplements had ever been shown to be defective. And this was after Maine tested them, and this was after Walmart in the United States tested them, and they came up to be 100% not faulty. And yet they were gathered up in a monumental pile to some unknown location by some unknown people, and they disappeared forever off the shelves. 2 weeks after Pan, a committee was formed. It was called the Expert Committee. The Expert TGA Committee, which was formed in order for this committee to make recommendations that could well result in new amendments to the Therapeutic Goods Act, recommendations that had a very powerful influence in law. This committee consisted of various individuals, which I'm going to show you. So they were going to clean up the Australian supplement industry.
Can I say something?
Yeah, sure.
I called the TGA and asked them what they were going to do with all these confiscated supplements.
Right.
Because I said I had some animals that they could be fed to, and it
Right.
would be perfectly fine.
Yes.
Or put them into, a compost. And
Yes.
And they said, no, that's not possible.
Oh, very good. It wasn't possible. Did they? I guess they didn't tell you where all those supplements went.
No, they didn't know.
Well, that's very interesting because the recall of Pan Pharmaceutical supplements was actually a Class 1 recall, which means that the TGA believed that these supplements would cause death and disability, when in fact no such thing had ever happened. Certainly not with the supplements. In fact, no one had died of any supplements when used in a reasonable way. However, thank you for that, and I'd like to hear a bit more about that later. But what I'm showing you now, and we don't need to read every word, it is the individuals who were part of the expert committee that the TGA had created. I'll just point out some things here. So a lot of these individuals are very well qualified to be on this committee because they have knowledge about complementary medicine research and so on. But here we are, we have a number of people who were part and parcel of the Pharmaceutical Advisory Council already sitting on that committee. So here's the same list, and there are just simply more people there. We've got the Chief Health Officer, which is fine. We've got Professor Myers here from some of you may know him, from Southern Cross University here. And we also have Mr. Ross Johnson, who was the Vice President of Manufacturing Operations of the Asia Pacific region of Wyeth. Now, Wyeth is a pharmaceutical company that specializes in vaccines and drugs, and it also has a small range of supplements, and it has been expanding in the Asia Pacific region, just where Jim Salem and Pan Pharmaceuticals would be also supplying. And Wyeth in the year 2003 was running at a loss that January quarter. And were it not for their small supplement range, they would have run at an enormous loss that quarter. And so they were seeking to expand globally, but particularly in this region where, in fact, in China they have a massive operation. So they're now sitting on the expert committee of the TGA in charge of cleaning up the supplements. Now this brings us to the issue of pharmaceutical front organisations. And this is the Australian self-medication industry. The ASMI is a front organisation for many different companies, and I'll show you who they are shortly. They're a global organisation, and each country seems to have a branch of the self-medication industry, and we certainly have one here in Australia. But I had a look at the global organisation, and I'll just show you who they are so that you know who is sitting on your TGA committees. We have the president of Bayer Consumer Care Division, so we have Bayer and Wyeth again. I get a bit disorientated with the... So that's Wyeth. There's various other pharmaceutical companies. There's Pfizer, GlaxoSmithKline, GlaxoSmithKline Beecham, Boehringer Ingelheim, some Japanese pharmaceuticals, some German pharmaceuticals, and the Australian self-medication industry. Again, GlaxoSmithKline, Boots. These are members of the self-medication industry which sit on TGA committees. They represent a host of pharmaceutical companies, very big corporations. And we carry on now to the third page. Procter & Gamble, Dell Pharmaceuticals, the Chinese self-medication industry, and so last page we have the chairman of the Vietnam Pharmaceutical Companies Association, which is very interesting because Mr. Salem, after his company was demolished, applied for a license to manufacture and to reopen manufacturing in Vietnam. He was initially granted that license, as I understand it, but both ASIC and TGA are now preventing him and allege there was an abnormality, an irregularity with the paperwork, and they have now engaged him in yet more litigation about this, according to some of the mainstream media. It's interesting to note that the big pharmaceutical companies are also targeting that area for beginning and expanding their manufacturing industry. Pan Pharmaceutical was in direct competition with pharmaceutical industry. You know, 2003 was a very big year. A lot of things happened in that time that we will feel the influence of very greatly in the next year or two, but we can still stop it. Late in 2003, a treaty that had been drafted all that year was actually signed by the Australian government and the New Zealand government. That treaty is called, for short, the JTA Treaty, which is the Joint Tasman Agency Treaty. Now, there's a lot of names for this, which is a little bit confusing, but the long name, I shall quote you, it's the agreement between the Government of Australia and the Government of New Zealand for the establishment of a joint scheme for the regulation of therapeutic products. This is the treaty that was signed, actually, by the governments, but the implementation legislation has not yet gone through Parliament because it requires both Australia and New Zealand to pass the implementation legislation through their parliaments. And so far, the New Zealanders have prevented this because they've been lobbied the guts out of their independence and have actually prevented this from going ahead. But this treaty is conscious of Australians' obligations under the World Trade Organization, signed at Marrakesh on the 15th of April 1994. This WTO is in an international jurisdiction, as you will remember. Okay? So now we have this treaty which has been signed, which forms the legal basis upon which a brand new regulating agency can be formed. Good. Now we have the treaty. We have signed the treaty, and upon which is the new Trans-Tasman Agency, which will abolish the TGA as we know it. Okay? Because remember, it's a statutory body, and it will bring the whole regulator out into an international jurisdiction where the World Trade Organization and the treaties apply, and codex applies, and the World Health Organization apply out here internationally in this jurisdiction, which is a further arm's length from your parliament. Now this is a whole different ballgame. But wait, there's more. This has the form of a corporation. This has a corporate structure. Let me read you this. I've got the treaty here, and this can be downloaded by anyone. I have it on my website, which is www.evehillary.org. And you can usually follow the clicks and download and get your very own copy of the JTA Treaty and have a little read of it. Now, therapeutic use is defined. What is therapeutic use? Well, it's preventing, diagnosing, curing, or alleviating a disease, ailment, defect, or injury in humans, influencing, inhibiting, or modifying a physiological process in humans. That makes this a therapeutic good. Cheers. But wait, there's more. To avoid trade barriers, they say. It's all written in the treaty. Have you ever heard of the level playing field?
Sure, heard of it.
It's it seems to be another name for levelling the competition, so that the corporations can come and play on the play field without trade barriers. Here we go. It's in Article 6 of the JTA Treaty. The board. The board is hereby established by the chairman of the board, the managing director of the agency, a person with broad experience in relation to public health and regulatory matters in New Zealand, and another such person in Australia. Who will they be? Who are they? And guess what? A person with broad experience in commercial matters. And who might they be? Well, fact is, we don't know. And the fact is, once they're installed, how are we going to have any say about it? Because they've just shifted it out, an offshore corporation. Okay, so this is not too bad reading. I think it's about 20 or so pages, and you would be very surprised the fact that this has already been signed. Okay, now, when you have a situation of an offshore corporation regulator in an international jurisdiction, it brings about all sorts of commercial possibilities, doesn't it? And guess what? That means we have to have an advertising agency. And that's exactly what was set up with the help of the TGA, called the Trans-Tasman Advertising Scheme. Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Now, here is who was on the TGA committee. We've got a number of bureaucrats, we've got a number of peak body representatives, and we've got the pharmacy representative, and we've got the self-medication industry with the whole raft of pharmaceuticals, which is a front company, a front organisation. We've got the medical profession representative, as if they would be the experts in natural therapies. We've got the Australian, we've got them again. We've got SMI. We've got two self-medications, one from Australia, one from New Zealand. Consumer representatives, and the Advertising Standards Authority of New Zealand, and so on and so forth. Okay, well, that's all right. That's not too bad. So then there was a series of stakeholder meetings as well. So they went out and had a whole series of these meetings about the advertising code, because, you see, they were now rewriting what you could and couldn't say in the media. So print, electronic, and so on, about drugs and about supplements. So here are the stakeholders: the Pharmaceutical Advisory Council, the media representatives, the self-medication industry again. We had a few people who actually should really be there, and we had some high-profile manufacturer of supplements: Johnson & Johnson, Pfizer, Reckitt Benckiser, Unilever, Maine, Pharmacy Guild, Pharmaceutical Society, the Vet Society, and Roche Pharmaceuticals. Another couple of TGA committees. Well, what do we all make of this? Well, I'll tell you something very interesting. This situation makes strange bedfellows. When they organised the treaty, the JTA treaty, and they'd signed it, they then invited some submissions to the Joint Standing Committees on Treaties to Parliament, and one of those was the AMA. And so the AMA gave their submission, and this is from this particular document, which was authored or signed off by Robin Napier of the AMA. And this document, this is the second page of it, Robin Napier brought to the attention of the Parliament after the treaty had been signed. This was already 30th of April 2004, so they'd actually signed it already before they called for submissions. Okay, thank you. At least we can't say they didn't ask. Now, Dr. Robin was very concerned because she hadn't been consulted before that time. And if I can just read it off the board, she said that this process has largely occurred without the knowledge of the public. Indeed. The process is occurring against a backdrop of enormous pressure on a number of fronts, including PBS spending. Now, if you'll recall, what this is the taxpayer buying drugs for the people. Right? She's also concerned about the pharmaceutical companies and others opening up direct-to-consumer advertising and downscheduling medicines to categories where direct-to-consumer advertising is possible. Now, what that means is this. The pharmaceutical companies manufacture drugs, many of which are over-the-counter drugs. They're called Schedule II drugs, but many of which, probably most of which, are prescription drugs, which are Schedule IV drugs. So what is happening is that these companies lobby TGA and other departments, and they rewrite the code here. The advertising code's been rewritten, but first they have to downschedule prescription medicines and make them over-the-counter drugs so that they can advertise them. And you may have already noticed some advertisements for drugs on the television.
And self-medicate.
Thank you. Yes. Some advertisements for drugs. So that means that your elderly parents or your teenage daughter can go to the chemist and get what was once a prescription drug. Meanwhile, the code for supplements has been tightened up very considerably. And many people now cannot even mention, if they have a herbal tea that they have on the market or something, cannot even mention the word cleansing or any other such thing like an immune system or any other such thing, even with herbs where it is known to have that effect and where those claims are quite correct, proper and proven. In fact, to show you this, there was from one of our previous seminars, an individual there who had such herbs on offer and whom the TGA went through like a dose of salts. But those very same herbs were actually in the tea of a multinational company. And there were claims in the advertising of that company, and that was allowed. But the person who had the herbs had to redo all of the labels and packaging, and it damn nearly killed them. All right, well, this is my favourite part, because I get to tell you about how this is all tied up with codex. You all been waiting for that? Right. Now, what I'm going to present to you comes from this document, which is the Codex Alimentarius Commission of the World Health Organization. The Codex Commission, the 27th session in Bonn, Germany, conducted in November 2003, and this is the report, okay? So everything I'm going to show you comes from that report, and here is the cover sheet, just to show you the document. And you're welcome to inspect it, or you're welcome to actually download it yourself and have a copy, okay? There's links to it at the end of the article. The article is sourced and referenced. There are 3 or 4 pages of sources and references you can click on to the original documents. Just to show you, this is the second page, and they're working, this committee, on the proposed draft guidelines for vitamin and mineral supplements. All right? Simply to show you what they're working on. So this is not fish. You will see some of your fact sheets coming from government sources that say, well, we're not in Codex, but we have a fisheries and agriculture person who does go to the Fishery and Agriculture Codex Committee. So this is not about fish. This is about, here we are, here's the table of contents, the proposed draft for guidelines for vitamin and mineral supplements. You see? They're very busily at work determining upper levels for vitamins and minerals. Upper levels. Now that means that whatever those levels are, we can't exceed it. And as you probably know of therapeutic doses of supplements given to people to recover from major illness, those doses are quite high. They're therapeutic doses, and when used properly, they're amazingly effective. This is the whole complementary medicine field. This is the whole manufacturing area put upside down with different doses, with lower doses, with different kinds of ingredients. And from what's come out of that committee so far, we are looking at greater numbers of synthetically derived vitamins and other supplements. Now, the committee agreed to advance the proposed draft guidelines, so they're advancing it step by step. You've heard of a several-step process? They're up to step 5. Now, in some of the fact sheets that come from the TGA, they will say that step-by-step doesn't exist. This comes from a website from someone who doesn't know what they're talking about, and yet here we are. They've advanced to step 5, slowly but surely. And here we have another page. These guidelines apply to what? To food? To what? Vitamin and mineral supplements. Upper safe levels of vitamins. Safe levels, and who will determine that? There have been safe levels for hundreds of years. The standards of the supplement industry have been formed for hundreds of years. It has an enviable safety record. Just in case you're wondering by now what this has to do with Australia, because you remember from the fact sheets you're getting from the TGA and other consumer bodies and manufacturers' representatives, this has nothing to do with Australia. Nothing whatsoever. The committee accepted the proposal of the delegation of Australia. So they've been hard at work. Did you send them over? And agreed to consider Agenda Item 10, the application for risk analysis, to the work of this refers to the particular committee that's doing this work. And so on and so on. So there was an Australian delegation. Now, I also looked at the table of delegates for this particular committee, and I found over 12 major pharmaceutical corporations sitting delegates on that committee. However, from that particular committee in 2003, we had from Australia a Ms. Janine Lewis, the principal nutritionist of the Food Standards Australia New Zealand from Canberra, attending as one of the delegates. Now, you will notice the fact sheets from the TGA. It says it has to do with food and not supplements. So they send the food standards people to determine the supplements. The following year, the Australian delegation grew, and there was an extra delegate, Miss Jane Allen, the senior nutritionist from the food standards. I'd like to read you from one of the fact sheets that's going around. And there are many. Have you all seen them? Here's one from the Australian Federal Government, Department of Ageing, Health and Ageing, from Christopher Pine. One of the main attacks that I've received from people is that some people allege that I don't know my facts because this new agency won't even come into effect until this time next year. And they base this on this particular press release from the Federal Health Department, from Christopher Pine, who says, Christopher Pine announced today that the new agency will be operational on the 1st of July 2006, whereas previously it was 2005, when suddenly and automatically the implementation legislation would be passed and this agency would be up and running. However, now they've postponed it for a little time, so people have alleged we should not worry because we've got a full year. However, further down he says,